Hello and welcome to the Intellect's Cove. I'm Colin Fairley. I'm a pragmatist philosopher and political theorist, and I work at Queen's University in Canada. And this is going to be the second video installment dealing with Chapter 9 of my new book, Aging and the Ethics of Longevity Science. Chapter 9 is titled The Good Life as a Constraint on Longevity Science. As I noted in the first video, the ideals of longevity science, whether it be in its form of disease control or rate control, should not be treated as a sacred value. That is, that survival and health span are not absolute, but rather morally laudable goals that have to be reasonably balanced with other moral interests, such as respect for autonomy. And in this video, I'm going to do a deep dive into Irving Zola's excellent article, Medicine as an Institution of Social Control, and talk about its relevance for thinking about the ideals of rate control. So the video that follows this will detail more specifically how attending to Zola's article can yield some sage insights for how we conceptualize the ideals of rate control. In this video, I'm going to focus mostly on Zola's concerns that apply to the war against disease, and so the aspirations of disease control. Now, Irving Zola was a pioneer in the sociology of disability. His article, Medicine as an Institution of Social Control, was published in the early 1970s in the Sociological Review. And Zola himself developed polio as a child that created a physical disability. He also was in a car accident. He was an advocate of limiting the scope and purview of medical science so that it didn't medicalize all aspects of our social existence. And so I've taken a snippet here from his article where he summarizes the central concern that motivates it. The theme of this essay is that medicine is becoming a major institution of social control, nudging aside, if not incorporating, the more traditional institutions of religion and law. It is becoming the new repository of truth, the place where absolute and final judgments are made by supposedly morally neutral and objective experts. And these judgments are made not in the name of virtue or legitimacy, but in the name of health. Okay, so I think Zola's concerns are definitely worth taking seriously. As we'll see, I agree partly with Zola, but I don't go all the way, and so I push back in particular against the more kind of libertarian sentiments that that follow from his position. But I also believe that his concerns have validity, and I point to historical examples where we can see the tendency for public health and medicine to be religion-like and overly coercive. So Zola in particular was worried that the war against disease that was initially designed to apply to infectious diseases was going to be applied to the chronic conditions of later life, and that this would require medicine to expand exponentially its intrusion into people's lifestyle and behavior. And Zola was certainly correct about this. I think there's both good and bad examples of this expansion, but he believed that in principle, this expansion was going to be morally objectionable. Because public health was always committed to changing social aspects of life, from sanitary to housing to working conditions, and often used the arm of the state through laws and legal power to gain its ends. So initially, it was going to be things like quarantines and vaccinations, but Zola predicted that, as public health expanded its concerns to the chronic conditions of later life, it would now look at what people are eating, how much exercise they're doing, how much sleep they're getting. And certainly this is true. Over the last 50 years, public health has expanded its scope of concern to these types of behaviors and lifestyles. Now, the question really is whether it's done so in ways that are morally objectionable. And I think it's a mix of yes and no, rather than a categorical no across the board. One of the articles that Zola pointed to at the time was a piece in Time magazine from the late 1960s called To Save the Heart, Diet by Decree. And he argued that this is an example of medicalizing society, that now public health and medicine were saying, look, the diet of the average American in the late 1960s had too much fat, bad oils. This legitimates government intervention into the diet of the population. And this was an expansion in Zola's perspective. This was a troubling expansion of government, is becoming religion-like by now, adopting a kind of paternalistic view on what people are consuming. So another snippet from his piece: the belief in the omnipresence of disorder is further enhanced by a reading of the scientific, pharmacological, and medical literature, for there one finds a growing litany of indictments of unhealthy life activities, from sex to food, from aspirins to clothes, from driving your car to riding the surf. It seems that under certain conditions, or in combination with certain other substances or activities, or if done too much or too little, virtually anything can lead to certain medical problems. And this, I've highlighted this sentence here, which I think is a great quotation. In short, I at least have finally been convinced that living is injurious to health. This remark is not meant as fastidiously as it may sound, but rather every aspect of our daily life has in it elements of risk to health. All right, so I think Zola's article is a brilliant essay and definitely worth taking seriously, both for the ideal of disease control, but also for the ideal of rate control. And because it's now a historical piece and that it's 50 years old, we can look at how the war of disease has expanded in both ways that I think are morally defensible, but also were morally problematic, to generate some sage insights for how we approach the ideal of rate control, so that we don't repeat the same mistakes that were made in the war against disease. So Zola, his main concern then is that it's kind of like a crystal ball. He was predicting that government power would expand in morally problematic ways as it expands its purview and concern about the behaviors and lifestyle of the population. Now, I think that the tale of the journey through the ocean of longevity is a mix of success and error. I certainly believe that public health did make some of the mistakes that Zola was anticipating in terms of its expansion of the war against disease to the chronic conditions. And there are a plurality of examples one could point to where I think public health took a heavy-handed approach in ways that threatened and compromised individual autonomy, and were not always predicated on sound science. But I also believe that there are success stories where medicine pursued empirically valid and morally defensible interventions that have saved lives and added important benefits to human life expectancy. So I'm going to survey just a few of these. It's covered much more detail in the chapter itself, but let me give a few examples. Now, this concern for the expansion of government power, I think my pushback against Zola is that he is guilty of, or at least potentially guilty of, a status quo bias, in that if we presume that the right balance between autonomy and public health intervention is what happens to be in, the early 1970s in the United States or late 1960s, that represented the optimal balance. This would be a kind of status quo bias where if we just assume that the more minimalist stance of public health in the mid 20th century was the legitimate one. I think this trade-off is one that's constantly being recalculated as we gain new empirical insights, both about the severity of the harm of non-intervention and the costs and benefits of modulating that trade-off. So I do think Zola is guilty of a kind of status quo bias, and that's the reason why I don't go full on with his position, though I do take his concern as one that is worthy of serious consideration. And so I'm going to just highlight a few examples from traffic mortality, heart disease, the war on drugs, gun violence, etc., as examples, I think, that have both success and setbacks in each of these domains. So let's take car accidents. And as I noted, Zola himself suffered a physical disability from a car accident that that he was involved in when he was younger. Now, that would be one area where I'd say it's been a good thing that public health has expanded its concern for reducing mortality from automobile accidents and injury from them. According to the World Health Organization, the highest rate of mortality from car accidents is in lower middle income countries. Per 100,000 people, there's a huge disparity between low and high income countries. So in high income countries, less than 9 people out of 100,000 will end up dying in a car accident. But that is as high as nearly 28 people in low middle income countries. So countries that do not have the kinds of regulation around car safety that the more advanced high income countries have. So the African region has the highest road traffic fatality at 26.6 people, while the European region has the lowest, under 10, so less than half. So I think that, reducing automobile mortality is a good example of how expanding public health's concern to reducing the risk of death and injury from automobiles through legislation on seatbelts. And, now we have things like distracted driving. So these are more of what Maxwell calls the problems of living. People, texting while they're driving leads to death every day. And I think that this is an example where the trade-off between respect for autonomy and reducing premature death is warranted. Things like drinking and driving. So again, during the time that Zola was writing, that wasn't seen as a priority for public health. And now, there's serious penalties if one is driving above a certain blood alcohol level. And again, I would argue that those are defensible interventions, and that Zola's position had a kind of status quo bias, that we assume that not wearing seatbelts, not having cars that are safer, being able to drink and drive, and these other things were, respect for some kind of maximal autonomy. But seatbelt laws, coupled with safety improvements, are an integral part, I would argue, of wisdom inquiry longevity science, addressing a host of the problems of living, that's a term from Maxwell, such as safe transportation, distracted driving, so that a population's survival time is increased by reducing motor vehicle fatalities. So I think when it comes to preventing car accident mortality, I come down on the side of public health. I think that's a good example, though, Zola would have argued this is medicalizing transportation. But I think it's a justified medicalizing of transportation, because transportation can be associated with mortality and a lot of injury. And if there's if there's empirically valid ways of intervening to reduce the unnecessary death and injury from automobile accidents, then I think that that is a justified intervention. Similarly, on heart disease also, so recall the Time magazine article about healthy diets that Zola was concerned about. This actually has resulted in a significant reduction of coronary heart disease. Data from the United States from this the article by Ford in the New England Journal of Medicine estimates that roughly 340,000 deaths were reduced from coronary heart disease in the year 2000 because of public health intervening in trying to reduce the lifestyle and behaviors that would contribute to higher rates of heart disease. So again, like the devil's in the detail. In principle, I wouldn't, unlike Zola, I don't see public health expanding its concern, promoting. It depends on whether or not it's nudges, such as encouraging healthy diets versus like mandates. And so there are some details about the means chosen to pursue those ends. But unlike Zola's position, which I think suffers a status quo bias, I think a more flexible trade-off approach that recognizes the bigger the public health benefits and the lesser the incursion into autonomy, then the more sage the insight that public health should intervene. Ford and colleagues estimate that approximately 44% of the mortality reduction could be attributed to changes in risk factors such as reductions in cholesterol, blood pressure, smoking, and physical inactivity. Now, Zola might protest that this makes public health a religion and like law, but I would say that many of these interventions are morally defensible and that the benefits have outweighed the concerns that Zola articulates. But that's not to say that there aren't more clear cases where this trade-off has been compromised. And so in principle, Zola's concerns, I think, are valid when applied to other examples of the war against disease. So the ones that I think amplify much more effectively the concerns that Zola has raised, I won't go into the details here, but in the chapter, I look at the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, and there was definitely a lot of fear and stigma, coercive interventions of criminalizing sexual relations that were based not on empirical evidence. And so certainly the war against disease, when it's applied in the early 1980s to try to prevent the spread of HIV and AIDS, I think there are lots of good examples there that amplified Zola's concerns about the coercive element of the government. And even the war against drugs, I think also there's a lot of great research done by Carl Hart on how the war against drugs in the United States is basically predicated on racism rather than empirical evidence from a public health perspective. So I think it's tricky to determine the autonomy versus public health balance. I think there are clear cases where public health has contravened respect for autonomy. And then there are other examples going against Zola where I think public health has legitimately expanded its concern. So I won't go through all that. It require a lot more time than I have here, but in that chapter, I go through a bunch of historical examples to show cases where Zola's concerns were manifest and other examples where I think we could push back against Zola's concern and argue that. So just a little snippet on the war against drugs. So the Lancet published a lengthy report in the Lancet on the war against drugs, and it argued that coercive drug policies were often predicated on assumptions about drug use and drug dependence that were not scientifically grounded. The report found that paradoxically, while policies that prohibit drugs are often defended as necessary to preserve public health and safety, the evidence suggests that they have contributed directly and indirectly to lethal violence, communicable disease transmission, discrimination, forced displacement, unnecessary physical pain, and the undermining of people's right to health. So I think the war against drugs is perhaps the strongest example of where Zola's concerns are legitimate, that it was not based on real science, and it was targeted in ways that were discriminatory, and it had adverse side effects that outweighed any potential benefits of its pursuit. So the war against drugs, I would say, is a good example of taking heed of Zola's warnings because it has been the heavy coercive use, and it's been framed as a public health campaign when, in fact, I think the empirical evidence does not vindicate its aggressive pursuit in this fashion, especially in the way it's being pursued in the United States. So ultimately, then, what I'm concerned with for Zola, the reason I bring so much attention to Zola's essay is I want to see whether or not we should apply his concern about medicine as an institution of social control to aging research. So, is it an example of medicalizing society and aging? Or is there a status quo aging bias in Zola's position? And he actually does talk about medicalizing aging. So it's a great segue into the third video, which I will post after this one, about what we can take from Zola's essay in terms of some sage insights for thinking about pursuing the ideal of rate control. All right, so this concludes the second video that's focused on Zola and some historical examples. I partially agree with Zola and partially disagree. The devil's in the detail. I think there are clear cases where a recalibration of the balance between respect for autonomy and promoting public health has come down on the side of public health. And I think there are other examples where the science was not valid and the state intervention was overly expansive or coercive, where we should have heeded Zola's concerns and prioritized respect for individual autonomy. In the third and final video for this chapter, I'm going to get to the thrust of the take-home message for the ideal of rate control. The key thing is not to replicate the same mistakes that were made in the war against disease. All right, so I'm trying to steer the steamship of public health in the right direction. If we're going to pursue rate control, we should pursue it in empirically valid and morally defensible ways. And that has real implications for the non-pharmacological and pharmacological potential interventions to slow down human aging.